For 15 years, I survived on scraps and willpower, clawing my way up from nothing while my parents lived in their mansion, sipping champagne and telling everyone their daughter was studying abroad. But then I found the documents, locked away in a storage unit I didn't even know existed, and suddenly everything made sense. The pregnancy wasn't just an embarrassment they wanted to erase. It was a threat to an empire built on lies, fraud, and blood money. They didn't just abandon me. They tried to bury me. And when I realized what they'd done, what they were still doing, I knew exactly how to make them pay. This is the story of how I went from a pregnant teenager thrown out like garbage to the woman who orchestrated my parents' complete and total destruction. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Victoria Blake, though most people call me Tori. 15 years ago, I was 17 years old, a junior at Mountain View High School in Denver, Colorado, living what I thought was a privileged life in the Cherry Creek neighborhood. My father, Richard Blake, owned Blake Development Corporation, one of the most successful commercial real estate companies in Colorado. My mother, Patricia Blake, spent her days organizing charity galas, sitting on museum boards, and making sure the Blake name was synonymous with elegance, philanthropy, and old money prestige. We lived in a sprawling estate with manicured gardens, a circular driveway, and more square footage than any family of three could ever need. I wore designer clothes, drove a luxury sedan my parents had gifted me for my 16th birthday, and attended private school events where champagne flowed even though half of us weren't old enough to drink. From the outside, I had everything. From the inside, I had parents who valued reputation over everything else, including their own daughter. I met Jordan Mitchell during my sophomore year. He worked part-time at a coffee shop near my school, saving money for community college while helping his single mother pay rent. He had warm brown eyes, an easy smile, and absolutely none of the pretentious arrogance that defined most of the boys in my social circle. My parents hated him instantly. He wasn't from their world. His mother cleaned houses for a living. He didn't summer in Aspen or know which fork to use at formal dinners. To them, Jordan was a stain on the pristine image they'd cultivated for decades. They forbade me from seeing him, which of course only made me more determined. We dated in secret for over a year, stolen moments between classes, late-night phone calls, weekend meetups at places my parents would never go. I loved him. I loved the way he saw me as Tori, not as the Blake heiress, not as a trophy to parade at country club events. Just me. And then in February of 2010, I found out I was pregnant. I was terrified. I was 17, still in high school, with no idea how to handle something this enormous. But Jordan held my hand and promised we'd figure it out together. He was scared too, but he didn't run. He didn't blame me. He said we'd get through it, that we'd build a life for our baby even if it meant working 3 jobs and living in a tiny apartment. For a brief, naive moment, I thought maybe my parents would surprise me. Maybe they'd be angry at first but eventually come around. Maybe they'd see that I needed their support and choose their daughter over their reputation. I was so incredibly wrong. It was March 15, 2010, a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because it was unseasonably warm, one of those early spring days in Denver where the sun felt like a promise of better things ahead. I'd spent the day at school, trying to focus on calculus and English lit while my mind spun in anxious circles about how to tell my parents. Jordan had offered to come with me, to stand beside me when I broke the news, but I told him I needed to do it alone first. I drove home that afternoon with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I parked in the circular driveway, walked up the stone steps and reached for the doorknob. It didn't turn. I tried again, thinking maybe it was just stuck. Nothing. I pulled out my key, the one I'd had since I was 13, the one that had always worked. I slid it into the lock and turned. It didn't fit. The lock had been changed. Confusion turned to panic as I rang the doorbell, pounded on the door, called out for my parents. No one answered. I walked around to the side entrance, the back door, even tried the garage. Every lock had been changed. Every entry point sealed. And then I saw them. 3 black garbage bags sitting at the end of the driveway, stuffed full and tied shut. I walked over, my heart hammering in my chest, and tore one open. Inside were my clothes, my shoes, my books, my laptop, everything that had been in my bedroom just that morning, now crammed into trash bags like I was nothing more than refused to be discarded. I stood there on the perfectly manicured lawn of the house I'd grown up in, staring at those bags, and something inside me cracked. Not broke, not shattered, just cracked, like the first fracture in a dam that's holding back an ocean. I pulled out my phone and called my mother. She answered on the third ring, her voice calm and clipped. "Where are you?" I asked. "Why are the locks changed? Why are my things in garbage bags on the lawn?" There was a pause, a silence so cold it felt like winter had returned in an instant. Then she spoke, and her words sliced through me with surgical precision. "You are no longer welcome in this house, Victoria. You've made choices that are incompatible with this family's values and reputation. Your father and I have discussed it, and we've decided it's best if you find your own way from now on. You're 17, nearly an adult. You'll manage." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother's voice, so detached, so devoid of emotion, as if she were discussing a failed investment rather than abandoning her only child. "What about school?" I finally managed to choke out. "What about my future? What about the baby?" Another pause. Then, in a tone that could freeze fire, she said, "That's your problem now, Victoria. We will not be associated with this embarrassment. Do not contact us. Do not come to the house. If you attempt to, we will have you removed by the police. Goodbye." The line went dead. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe hours. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn, and I just stood there holding 3 garbage bags that contained my entire life. Eventually, I called Jordan. He arrived 20 minutes later, his face pale with shock and fury when I told him what had happened. He loaded the bags into his beat-up sedan, and we drove to his mother's apartment, a 1-bedroom unit in a complex on the other side of town. His mother, a kind woman named Angela who worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me into a hug without asking a single question. "You can stay here," she said simply. "We'll figure it out." And we did. Sort of. I finished my junior year taking classes at night while working during the day at a grocery store. Jordan picked up extra shifts at the coffee shop. I slept on their couch, my belly growing rounder with each passing week, feeling the baby kick while I studied for exams and tried to ignore the looks from classmates who whispered about the Blake girl who'd gotten knocked up and thrown out. My parents made sure everyone knew their version of the story. I was reckless, they said. Ungrateful. They tried to help me, but I'd refused their guidance and chosen this path. The narrative spread through Denver's social circles like wildfire. Poor Richard and Patricia, people whispered. Their daughter was such a disappointment. On November 3, 2010, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl. I named her Lily after Jordan's grandmother. She had his eyes and my stubborn chin, and the moment the nurse placed her in my arms, I made a silent vow. I would give her everything I'd lost. I would build a life for us no matter what it took. Jordan proposed to me in the hospital room 2 days later, a simple silver band he'd saved for months to buy. I said yes, not because I needed to be married, but because I loved him and because I wanted Lily to grow up in a home filled with love, not money and appearances. We got married at a courthouse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. House the following spring. No white dress, no fancy reception, just us, Angela, and a judge who smiled and wished us luck. We moved into a tiny apartment in Lakewood, barely big enough for the 3 of us, but it was ours. I worked during the day, Jordan worked nights, and we tag-teamed taking care of Lily. I finished high school through an adult education program, then enrolled in community college, taking classes online while Lily napped. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. There were nights when I cried in the bathroom because I didn't know how we'd pay rent. Nights when I stared at the ceiling and wondered if my parents had been right, if I'd ruined my life. But then I'd look at Lily, at her tiny fingers and her bright eyes, and I'd remember why I was doing this. By the time I was 25, I'd earned my bachelor's degree in finance from an online university, working my way through with scholarships and sheer determination. I took an entry-level job at a consulting firm that specialized in real estate fraud detection. Ironic, considering my father's business, but I was good at it. I understood how developers manipulated numbers, how they hid assets, how they exploited loopholes. I climbed the ranks quickly, and by the time I turned 30, I'd started my own consulting firm. Blake Financial Solutions. I kept my married name professionally so no one connected me to Richard and Patricia Blake. I was Victoria Mitchell now, a self-made woman who'd built a reputation for uncovering financial crimes that others missed. And my parents, they continued living their perfect lives. Blake Development Corporation expanded, acquiring properties across Colorado and into neighboring states. Patricia chaired more charity boards, hosted bigger galas, smiled for cameras at political fundraisers. They never reached out. Not once in 15 years. No phone call, no letter, no acknowledgement that they had a granddaughter they'd never met. It was as if I'd ceased to exist the moment they changed those locks. I told myself I'd moved on. I told myself I didn't care anymore. That their rejection had made me stronger. That I'd built a better life without them. And in many ways that was true. Jordan and I had a solid marriage. Lily was thriving, a bright, confident 15-year-old who had no idea her grandparents had thrown her mother away like trash. I'd created a life I was proud of, a business I'd built from nothing. But deep down, in a place I rarely allowed myself to visit, there was still a wound that hadn't healed. A 17-year-old girl standing on a lawn, holding garbage bags, watching the door of her childhood home remain closed. Then, 3 months ago, everything changed. I received a call from a woman named Rebecca Walsh. The name didn't register at first, but when she explained who she was, memory flooded back. Rebecca had been our housekeeper when I was growing up, a quiet woman in her 50s who'd worked for my parents for over 20 years. She'd always been kind to me, slipping me cookies when my mother was on one of her restrictive diet kicks, asking about school, treating me like a person rather than an ornament. I hadn't thought about her in years. Her voice on the phone was shaky, nervous. "Miss Victoria," she said, using the name she'd always called me. "I know it's been a long time, and I don't know if you'll even want to hear from me, but there's something you need to know. Something about your parents. Something I should have told you years ago. We met at a diner on the outskirts of Denver, far from anywhere my parents or their circle would frequent." Rebecca looked older, more tired, as if carrying a secret for 15 years had aged her prematurely. She slid a manila folder across the table, her hands trembling. "I found these," she said. "I was cleaning out a storage unit your father rented, one he thought no one else knew about. He'd stopped paying rent, and the facility contacted me because I was listed as an emergency contact from years ago. They were going to auction off the contents, so I went to clear it out. And I found this." I opened the folder. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Financial records, legal contracts, correspondence between my father and various business associates. At first glance they seemed routine, just business paperwork. But as I read closer, as I saw the dates and the names and the figures, my blood turned to ice. These weren't just business documents. They were evidence of fraud, embezzlement, money laundering schemes that stretched back decades. Blake Development Corporation wasn't successful because my father was a brilliant businessman. It was successful because he'd been stealing, bribing, and manipulating his way to the top for over 30 years. But that wasn't the worst part. As I flipped through the pages, I found a series of emails dated March of 2010, the month they'd locked me out. The emails were between my father and a man named Gregory Winters, a lawyer who specialized in what the emails delicately referred to as reputation management. In the emails, my father laid out a problem. His teenage daughter was pregnant, and the timing was catastrophic. Not because of the pregnancy itself, but because of a deal he was closing. A massive development project called Mountain Ridge, a luxury shopping and residential complex that required approval from the city council and significant investment from a group of conservative, family values investors. If word got out that his daughter was an unwed pregnant teenager, it could jeopardize the entire deal, cost him millions, potentially expose other irregularities in his business practices. Gregory Winters' advice was chillingly simple. Remove the problem. Make it clear she's no longer your responsibility. If necessary, ensure she has no legal standing to make claims against the family. The next email in the chain was my father's response. Locks changed today. Belongings removed. Patricia handled the call. She won't be back. As far as anyone's concerned, she's studying abroad and chose to cut ties with us due to her own reckless behavior. Mountain Ridge closes in 2 weeks. This never happened. I sat in that diner booth staring at those words, and the crack that had formed 15 years ago finally split wide open. They hadn't kicked me out because I disappointed them or because they were ashamed. They kicked me out because I was bad for business. I was a liability, a potential obstacle to a multimillion-dollar deal, and they discarded me like I was nothing. Worse, they'd planned it. They'd coordinated it. They'd made sure I had no recourse, no way to fight back, because I was 17 and powerless, and they were Richard and Patricia Blake, pillars of the Denver community. Rebecca watched me, her eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. I'm so sorry, Victoria. I didn't know about any of this until after you were gone. If I'd known, I would have done something, I swear. I wanted to be angry at her, but I couldn't. She was just another person caught in my parents' web. Instead, I asked her the only question that mattered. Is there more? She nodded. There's a lot more. Your father's been doing this for decades. Bribing city officials, falsifying inspection reports, hiding assets offshore. And your mother, she's not just some oblivious socialite. She's been helping him. The Blake Foundation, all those charity events, it's a front. They've been using it to launder money and create tax shelters. I've got copies of everything. I thought you should have them. I thought you deserved to know the truth. I took the folder, thanked Rebecca, and left the diner. I sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour, just staring at the manila folder on my passenger seat. 15 years. 15 years of struggling, of building a life from nothing, of carrying the weight of their rejection. And all of it, every moment of pain, every sleepless night, every time I'd wondered if I was worth loving, had been because of a business deal. I wasn't their daughter. I was collateral damage. Something crystallized in me in that moment. Something cold and sharp and unbreakable. They'd thrown me away to protect their empire. Now I was going to use everything I'd learned, every skill I'd honed, every connection I'd made, to burn that empire to the ground. Not for revenge, though I won't pretend that wasn't part of it, but for justice. Because if they'd done this to me, if they'd been running schemes for decades, how many other people had they hurt? How many families had they destroyed in their pursuit of wealth and status? I'd spent 15 years surviving. Now it was time to make them answer for what they'd done. I drove home, kissed Lily goodnight, and sat down at my desk. Jordan found me there at 2 a.m, surrounded by documents, my laptop open, pages of notes scattered everywhere. He didn't ask questions. He just brought me coffee, kissed the top of my head, and said, "Whatever you need, I'm with you." I looked up at him, this man who'd stood by me when I had nothing, who'd helped me build a life, who'd never once made me feel like I was less than I was. I smiled, the first real smile I'd felt in days. "I know," I said, "and I'm going to need all the help I can get, because I'm about to take down Richard and Patricia Blake, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows exactly who they really are." I grew up believing I was fortunate. That was the word everyone used when they talked about the Blake family. Fortunate. Blessed. Privileged. Our estate sat on 3 acres in Cherry Creek, one of Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods, where homes started at several $1,000,000 and only climbed from there. The house itself was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa with cream-colored stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and iron balconies that overlooked gardens maintained by a team of landscapers who arrived every Wednesday like clockwork. Inside, marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and every room was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that screamed money without ever having to mention it. Original artwork hung on the walls, pieces my mother had acquired at auctions and gallery openings, not because she particularly cared about art but because owning it was expected of someone in her position. My childhood was a carefully curated performance. I attended Mountain View High School, a private institution where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary, and where the parking lot looked like a luxury car dealership. My classmates were the children of Colorado's elite, kids who summered in Europe and whose parents donated wings to hospitals. I took violin lessons, participated in debate club, volunteered at carefully selected charity events that looked good on college applications. Every aspect of my life was designed to reflect well on the Blake name, to reinforce the image my parents had spent decades constructing. We weren't just wealthy. We were respectable. We were important. We mattered. My father, Richard Blake, built his empire from what he always described as humble beginnings, though his version of humble still included a college education and seed money from my grandfather. He started Blake Development Corporation in his 30s, focusing initially on small commercial properties before gradually expanding into larger projects. shopping centers, office complexes, mixed-use developments that transformed neighborhoods and generated millions in profit. He had a talent for identifying undervalued properties, securing favorable zoning changes, and convincing investors that his vision was worth their money. By the time I was born, Blake Development Corporation was one of the most successful real estate firms in Colorado, with projects stretching across the state and into Wyoming and New Mexico. My father was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair that he kept impeccably styled and a commanding presence that filled whatever room he entered. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove a black Mercedes, and had a corner office in a downtown Denver high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city and the Rocky Mountains beyond. People deferred to him. City council members took his calls. Bankers approved his loans without hesitation. He sat on the boards of multiple organizations, donated generously to political campaigns, and was frequently featured in local business publications as an example of Colorado entrepreneurship at its finest. My mother, Patricia, was his perfect complement. Where he was the empire builder, she was the curator of our public image. She came from old Denver money, the kind of family whose name appeared on plaques in museums and university buildings. She'd been raised to understand that wealth came with certain responsibilities, chief among them the obligation to be seen supporting the right causes and associating with the right people. She chaired the board of the Denver Arts Foundation, organized annual charity galas that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, and maintained memberships at every club and organization that mattered in Denver society. She was beautiful in that timeless, carefully maintained way that money makes possible, with highlighted blonde hair always perfectly styled, designer clothing that never looked too trendy or too casual, and a smile that could charm donors into writing larger checks. Together, they were a power couple, the kind of people whose photographs appeared in the society pages of Denver magazines, always impeccably dressed, always at the right events, always saying the right things. They hosted dinner parties at our estate where Colorado's elite gathered to network and be seen. They vacationed in Aspen in winter and Scottsdale in summer. They gave generously to causes that enhanced their reputation, while providing valuable tax deductions. From the outside, they had everything. The perfect marriage, the perfect home, the perfect life. And I was supposed to be the perfect daughter. That role came with explicit and implicit expectations. I was expected to excel academically, to participate in activities that demonstrated well-roundedness and social consciousness, to dress appropriately for every occasion, to be polite and charming when introduced to my parents' associates, to never cause embarrassment or draw negative attention. My mother made these expectations clear from an early age. The Blake name means something, Victoria, she would tell me, adjusting my collar or critiquing my posture. Everything we do reflects on that name. You represent this family, and you will conduct yourself accordingly. I tried. For most of my childhood and early adolescence, I genuinely tried to be what they wanted. I maintained a high grade point average, volunteered at the soup kitchen my mother's foundation sponsored, played violin in the school orchestra, served on student council. I smiled at the dinner parties, made polite conversation with adults who patted my head and told my parents what a lovely daughter they had. I wore the dresses my mother selected, attended the cotillion classes she enrolled me in, learned which fork to use and how to write proper thank you notes. I absorbed the lessons about appearance and reputation, about the importance of being seen in the right places with the right people. But there was always something hollow about it, a fundamental disconnect between the life I was living and the person I felt myself to be. The constant performance exhausted me. Every interaction felt scripted. Every decision filtered through the lens of how it would reflect on the family. I existed not as Victoria Blake, an individual with my own thoughts and desires, but as a supporting character in my parents' carefully constructed narrative. When I expressed interest in studying creative writing instead of business or law, my father dismissed it as impractical. When I suggested volunteering at organizations that actually helped people rather than just providing networking opportunities for the wealthy, my mother explained that optics mattered and some causes were more appropriate than others. The pressure intensified as I got older. By my sophomore year of high school, my parents were already discussing college options, naturally focusing on prestigious institutions that would enhance the Blake brand. My mother began introducing me to the sons of her friends and business associates, Young men from similar backgrounds who were being groomed for positions in their family businesses or preparing for careers in law, medicine, or finance. These introductions were never explicitly framed as matchmaking, but the implication was clear. I was expected to eventually marry someone suitable, someone who would fit seamlessly into our world and produce grandchildren who would carry on the Blake legacy. That's when I met Jordan Mitchell, and everything began to unravel. It was September of my sophomore year, and I'd stopped at a coffee shop near school called the Daily Grind, a small independent place that most of my classmates avoided in favor of the upscale chain cafe closer to campus. I liked it precisely because it wasn't pretentious, because the coffee was good and cheap and the atmosphere was comfortable rather than curated. Jordan was working behind the counter, and when I ordered, he smiled at me like I was just another customer rather than someone whose family name appeared on buildings downtown. We started talking. Not the superficial small talk I was used to, but actual conversation. He asked what I was reading, and when I showed him the novel I'd brought for English class, he'd actually read it and had opinions about the themes and the ending. He recommended other books. He told me about community college classes he was taking at night while working to save money. He had dreams that didn't involve climbing some predetermined corporate ladder or maintaining appearances. He wanted to be a teacher, to work with kids who didn't have advantages, to make a difference in ways that weren't measured by profit margins and tax deductions. I found myself returning to the Daily Grind more frequently, timing my visits to coincide with Jordan's shifts. We'd talk between customers, conversations that stretched longer each time, covering everything from books and music to our frustrations with the paths our lives seemed locked into. He made me laugh. He listened when I talked, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak or calculating how to turn the conversation to his advantage. With him, I felt like I could be honest about my doubts and frustrations without being lectured about responsibility and family obligation. By winter break of that year, we were dating, though we kept it secret. I knew instinctively that my parents would disapprove. Jordan wasn't from their world. His mother, Angela, worked as a house cleaner for several families in Cherry Creek, ironically including some of my parents' friends. His father had left when Jordan was young, and Angela had raised him alone, working multiple jobs to keep them afloat. They lived in a modest apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of Denver. Jordan drove an old Honda with a dented bumper and wore jeans and thrift store shirts, rather than designer labels. By every metric my parents used to measure worth, he was unsuitable. But to me he was real in a way nothing else in my life was. When we were together, I didn't have to perform or calculate or worry about how things looked. I could just be Tori, a nickname only he used, a version of myself that felt more authentic than Victoria Blake had ever been. We'd meet at places far from Cherry Creek, taking long drives into the mountains or watching movies at the cheap theater where no one I knew would ever go. He introduced me to his mother, who hugged me without hesitation and made me dinner in their small kitchen, serving food on mismatched plates with more warmth than any catered meal at our estate had ever provided. I kept our relationship hidden for months, but eventually, inevitably, my mother found out. I'd been careless, mentioning a coffee shop location that didn't match where I'd said I'd be, and she'd driven by to check. She'd seen me through the window, sitting at a corner table holding hands with Jordan. She didn't confront me immediately. That wasn't her style. Instead, she waited until we were home, until my father had returned from work, and then she sat me down in his study, a room designed to intimidate with its dark wood paneling and wall of leather-bound books he'd never actually read. They didn't yell. That would have been undignified. Instead, they expressed disappointment, concern about my judgment, questions about what I thought I was doing associating with someone so clearly inappropriate. My mother described Jordan's background with barely concealed disdain, emphasizing his mother's occupation, his lack of prospects, the unsuitability of the match. My father was more direct. "This ends now," he said in the tone he used when delivering ultimatums to business rivals. "You will not see this boy again. You will focus on your studies and on relationships that are appropriate for someone in your position. This is not a discussion, Victoria. This is a fact." I tried to argue, to explain that Jordan was kind and smart and treated me better than anyone ever had, but my words bounced off their certainty like rain off stone. They weren't interested in who Jordan was as a person. They were interested only in how the relationship reflected on them, in the potential embarrassment of their daughter dating someone beneath her station. When I refused to agree to their demands, when I said I cared about Jordan and wouldn't stop seeing him just because they disapproved, my father's expression hardened into something cold and final. "You're being naive and foolish," he said. "But you're still a minor living under our roof, and you will abide by our rules. If you cannot do that, if you insist on pursuing this inappropriate relationship, there will be consequences." I didn't fully understand what he meant by consequences then. I thought he was threatening to ground me or take away privileges. I didn't realize he was already calculating what it would take to remove me from his carefully constructed world if I became too much of a liability. I saw Jordan in secret after that, more carefully, covering my tracks better. We both knew the situation was unsustainable, but we were 17 and in love and convinced that somehow we could make it work. We talked about the future, about life after high school when I'd be 18 and could make my own choices. Jordan would finish community college and transfer to a 4-year university. I'd study what I actually wanted to study. We'd build a life that was ours, not one prescribed by family expectations and social climbing. Then in February of my junior year, I missed my period. Then another. I bought a pregnancy test at a pharmacy across town where no one would recognize me. Took it in the bathroom of a gas station because I couldn't risk taking it home. 2 lines. Positive. I sat there on the grimy floor of that gas station bathroom, holding a plastic stick that had just rewritten my entire future, and felt the world shift beneath me. I was 17. I was still in high school. I was pregnant, and my parents were going to lose their minds. I told Jordan first. We met at our usual spot, a park overlooking the city where we'd spent countless afternoons talking about our dreams. When I told him, I watched his face carefully, part of me terrified he'd panic and disappear. But Jordan just took my hand, squeezed it tight, and said we'd figure it out together. He was scared, I could see that, but he didn't run. He didn't blame me. He just held me while I cried and promised that whatever happened, we'd face it together. We'd get married if that's what I wanted. He'd work full-time. We'd make it work somehow. But first I had to tell my parents. I agonized over it for days, rehearsing different ways to break the news, trying to find words that would make them understand that this wasn't the end of the world, that Jordan and I had a plan. I knew they'd be angry, but some naive part of me still hoped they'd eventually come around, that parental instinct would override their obsession with appearances. I was their daughter, their only child. Surely that meant something more than their reputation. I planned to tell them on a Saturday evening when they'd both be home, when we could sit down and have a real conversation. But fate intervened. On that Tuesday afternoon in March, I came home from school intending to study in my room before working up the courage to have the conversation that night. I never got the chance. The locks had been changed. My belongings were in trash bags on the lawn. And when I called my mother, when I heard her cold, detached voice explaining that I was no longer welcome, that I'd made my choice and now had to live with the consequences, I realized I'd never really known my parents at all. They weren't shocked by the pregnancy. They weren't blindsided by unexpected news. They'd known. Somehow they'd found out, probably through the same surveillance and control that had characterized my entire upbringing. And rather than talk to me, rather than offer any support or even express anger to my face, they'd simply erased me, changed the locks, packed my life into garbage bags, and severed me from the family as cleanly as a surgeon excising a tumor. I wasn't their daughter in that moment. I was a problem that needed to be eliminated, a threat to the image they'd spent decades cultivating. Standing on that lawn, holding those garbage bags, I felt everything I'd believed about my life disintegrate. The perfect family was a lie. The love I'd thought existed beneath the expectations and pressure was a lie. I'd spent 17 years trying to be the daughter they wanted, and the moment I deviated from their script, the moment I became inconvenient, they discarded me without hesitation. I was Victoria Blake, and my parents had just made it abundantly clear that the Blake name I'd carried my entire life meant absolutely nothing when measured against their obsession with maintaining appearances and protecting their precious reputation. Jordan arrived within the hour. His mother opened their small apartment to me without question, and as I settled onto their couch that first night, feeling the baby flutter inside me, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost and everything I'd have to build from nothing, I made a promise to myself. I would survive this. I would build a life for my child. And I would never ever let my parents' rejection define me. I was more than the Blake name. I was Tori Mitchell now, and I was going to prove that I was worth more than they'd ever given me credit for. The next months were a blur of survival and determination. Finishing school while working at a grocery store, my belly growing rounder as I stocked shelves and rang up customers who sometimes recognized me and whispered to each other about the Blake girl who'd fallen so far. Attending night classes to get my diploma because my parents had withdrawn me from Mountain View High, ensuring I couldn't graduate with my class and further embarrass them. Sleeping on Jordan's family couch, feeling the baby kick while I studied for exams under the dim light of a floor lamp borrowed from a neighbor. Jordan worked double shifts, taking every hour he could get at the coffee shop and picking up weekend work at a warehouse. His mother, Angela, became the maternal figure my own mother had never really been. She taught me how to cook cheap, nutritious meals. She took me to free prenatal clinics. She held my hand during ultrasounds and told me I was going to be a wonderful mother. She never once made me feel like a burden, even though I knew how much strain my presence put on their limited resources. My parents, meanwhile, continued their lives as if I'd never existed. I heard through the grapevine, through former classmates who'd messaged me with a mixture of pity and gossip, that my mother was telling people I'd gone to study abroad, that I'd decided to take a gap year in Europe before college. The lie was so audacious, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost had to admire the sheer boldness of it. They'd simply written me out of their story, replaced the inconvenient truth with a narrative that made them look like supportive parents whose daughter was out exploring the world. I gave birth to Lily on November 3, 2010. 23 hours of labor in a county hospital, Jordan holding my hand the entire time, Angela in the waiting room with a bag of snacks and magazines because she'd insisted on being there even though visiting hours were over. When the nurse placed Lily in my arms, this tiny, perfect being with Jordan's eyes and a fierce grip on my finger, I felt something shift fundamentally inside me. This was my family now. Not the estate in Cherry Creek or the parents who'd abandoned me. This screaming, beautiful baby and the people who'd stood by me when I had nothing. Jordan proposed 2 days later with a simple silver band, and I said yes. We got married at a courthouse in April. Just the three of us plus Angela and a judge who smiled kindly and wished us luck. No white dress, no reception, no guests beyond the people who actually mattered. It was the opposite of everything my mother had probably envisioned for my wedding, and it was perfect precisely because it was real. We moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Lakewood that we could barely afford. Jordan slept on the couch so Lily and I could have the bedroom. We survived on ramen and determination, taking turns caring for Lily while the other worked or studied. I enrolled in community college, taking online classes during Lily's naps, slowly working toward a degree while working part-time at various jobs that would hire someone with a baby and a flexible schedule. It was exhausting. There were nights I cried from sheer overwhelming pressure, wondering if my parents had been right, if I destroyed my future with my choices. But then Lily would smile at me, or Jordan would come home from a double shift and still have energy to hold me and tell me we were going to make it, and I'd remember why I was fighting. This life, hard as it was mine. I'd chosen it. And unlike the gilded cage of my childhood, it was real. The love was real. The struggles were real. And the victories, small as they sometimes were, meant something because I'd earned them. By my mid-20s, I'd earned my bachelor's degree in finance, graduating with honors despite the obstacles. I'd taken an entry-level position at a consulting firm that specialized in forensic accounting, using the skills I'd developed to help identify financial irregularities and fraud. I discovered I was good at it, brilliant even. I could look at spreadsheets and financial statements and see the patterns others missed. Identify the places where numbers didn't quite add up. My bosses noticed. I got promoted, then promoted again. And all the while, my parents continued building their empire, unaware that the daughter they'd thrown away was becoming an expert in exactly the kind of financial crimes that had built their fortune. They had no idea I existed in the same city, that I drove past their offices sometimes and felt nothing but cold determination. They'd made me invisible. Now I was going to use that invisibility to see everything they tried to hide. When Rebecca Walsh called me 3 months ago with news about the storage unit, with those documents that laid bare exactly what my parents had done and why they'd done it, the final piece clicked into place. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was ready. Ready to show Richard and Patricia Blake that the daughter they'd discarded like trash had become the one person who could destroy everything they'd built. They'd thrown me out to protect a business deal, Now I was going to dismantle that business piece by piece, and make sure the whole world knew exactly what kind of people Richard and Patricia Blake really were. The perfect daughter they tried to create had failed them, but the woman I'd become, forged in the fires of their rejection and abandonment, was about to become their worst nightmare. They'd taught me that appearances were everything, that reputation mattered more than truth. Now I was going to teach them that truth, once revealed, destroys appearances beyond repair. And I was going to enjoy every single moment of it. The documents Rebecca Walsh had given me sat in a locked safe in my home office, but I'd already scanned every page, uploaded encrypted copies to 3 separate cloud storage services, and memorized the most damaging details. I couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't stop replaying the contents in my mind during meetings with clients, during dinner with Jordan and Lily, during the quiet hours of early morning when I'd wake up and lie in the dark trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My parents hadn't just committed fraud. They'd built an entire criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business operations, and they'd done it for decades with such careful precision that no one had ever questioned them. The first thing I did was verify everything independently. I couldn't afford to move forward with incomplete information or documents that might be challenged in court. I needed to understand not just what my parents had done, but how they'd done it, who else was involved, and where all the evidence could be found. That meant bringing in professionals, people I trusted who had the expertise to help me build an airtight case. I called Amanda Torres on a Thursday morning, reaching her at her downtown Denver law office. Amanda and I had worked together on several cases over the years, situations where her legal expertise and my financial analysis had helped clients recover assets or prosecute fraud. She was sharp, relentless, and had a particular hatred for wealthy people who used their resources to exploit others. When I told her I needed to meet urgently about a personal matter, she cleared her schedule for that afternoon. Her office was in a converted warehouse building in the River North Art District, all exposed brick and modern furniture, the kind of space that announced she was successful but not part of the traditional legal establishment. I appreciated that about her. She built her practice representing people who couldn't afford the white shoe law firms, taking on cases others deemed too risky or not profitable enough. She won more often than she lost, and she'd earned a reputation for being willing to go after powerful defendants that other attorneys avoided. I spread the documents across her conference table, watching her face as she began reading. Her expression shifted from curious to focused to openly shocked as she worked through the papers. She spent nearly an hour reviewing everything, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification on technical financial details, before finally sitting back in her chair and letting out a low whistle. "This is massive," she said quietly. "Your father has been running a criminal enterprise for at least 25 years, maybe longer. The scope of this is staggering." I nodded, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't quite name. Anger, certainly, but also a strange kind of vindication mixed with sorrow for the naive girl who'd once believed her father was a legitimate businessman. Amanda started ticking off the crimes documented in the papers: wire fraud, mail fraud, bribery of public officials, money laundering through the foundation, tax evasion, filing false documents with regulatory agencies. The list went on. Some of the schemes were sophisticated, involving offshore accounts and shell corporations, and carefully structured transactions designed to obscure the flow of money. Others were almost brazen in their simplicity, like direct cash payments to city council members in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. The Mountain Ridge project, the development deal that had been closing when my parents threw me out, had been approved based on falsified environmental impact reports and inflated economic projections. My father had paid the consulting firm that prepared the reports, had bribed 2 council members who'd been skeptical, and had used foundation money to donate to the campaigns of 3 others who'd voted in favor. The project had gone forward, making him millions, while completely disregarding the environmental damage and the displacement of lower-income residents who'd lived in the area. But that was just one example. The documents showed similar patterns repeated across dozens of projects. Bribes disguised as consulting fees, campaign contributions timed to coincide with crucial votes, inspection reports altered to hide code violations, contracts awarded to companies that existed only on paper, funneling money into accounts controlled by my father and his associates. The Blake Foundation, which my mother had used to build her reputation as a philanthropist, was essentially a slush fund, taking in donations that provided tax deductions for wealthy contributors while spending minimal amounts on actual charitable work, and using the rest to pay for family expenses, political contributions, and payoffs to people who needed to be kept quiet. Can we prove all of this? I asked Amanda. She considered the question carefully. The documents are a strong start, but we need more. We need bank records, communication records, testimony from people involved in the schemes. Some of these documents are from your father's personal files, which means they could be challenged regarding how they were obtained. We need to build a case that doesn't rely solely on these, even though they give us a roadmap for where to look. I'd anticipated this. That's why I also called Kevin Grant. Kevin was a private investigator I'd worked with on several cases. A former Denver police detective who'd left the force after becoming frustrated with the politics and corruption he'd witnessed. He ran a small investigation firm that specialized in financial crimes, and he had connections throughout law enforcement and the business community. He was also one of the most thorough investigators I'd ever met, the kind of person who wouldn't stop digging until he'd uncovered every relevant fact. Kevin arrived at Amanda's office an hour later, and I went through everything again, explaining what the documents showed and what I needed him to find. He took notes in a small leather notebook, occasionally asking questions about specific transactions or individuals mentioned in the papers. When I finished, he leaned back and studied me with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and professional interest. "You understand this is going to get ugly," he said. "Once we start pulling these threads, once we start talking to people and requesting records, your parents are going to know someone's investigating them. They'll lawyer up, they'll try to intimidate witnesses, they'll use every resource they have to shut this down. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for what this might do to your daughter when it becomes public?" I'd thought about little else since Rebecca had handed me those documents. Lily was 15. A sophomore at a good public high school, thriving academically and socially. She had friends, she played soccer, she was thinking about colleges. She knew almost nothing about my parents, just that I'd been estranged from my family since before she was born. I told her once, years ago when she'd asked why she didn't have grandparents like her friends did, that sometimes families broke apart and it was complicated and adult and not her fault. She'd accepted that explanation with the easy resilience of childhood, and rarely brought it up anymore. But once this became public, once the investigation and inevitable prosecution started making headlines, she'd learn everything. She'd know that her grandparents had thrown her mother out while pregnant. She'd know they'd built their wealth through crime. She'd probably face questions and comments from classmates, from people who'd connect her last name to mine and start digging into our history. It would be painful and embarrassing and unfair, because she'd done nothing wrong, but would still have to deal with the consequences of my decision to pursue justice. Jordan and I had talked about it late into the night, lying in our bed while Lily slept down the hall, her door decorated with posters of bands and inspirational quotes like any normal teenager's room. He'd held my hand and listened as I explained everything I'd found, everything I was planning. He'd asked hard questions about whether this was really about justice or about revenge, whether I was prepared for the emotional toll it would take, whether I'd considered trying to move forward without reopening old wounds. But ultimately, he'd supported me. "If this is what you need to do," he'd said, "if you genuinely believe they need to be held accountable not just for what they did to you but for all the other people they've hurt, then I'm with you. We'll protect Lily as much as we can. We'll be honest with her and help her understand. And we'll get through it together like we've gotten through everything else." So I looked at Kevin and Amanda and nodded. "I'm prepared. This isn't just about me anymore. If we don't stop them, they'll keep doing this. They'll keep hurting people, keep corrupting the system, keep using their money and influence to get away with crimes that would send anyone else to prison. Yes, it's personal. Yes, part of me wants them to pay for throwing me away like garbage. But it's bigger than that now. It's about accountability. It's about proving that no one is above the law, no matter how much money they have or how respected they pretend to be." Amanda smiled, the kind of fierce smile that appeared when she was preparing for a fight she intended to win. "Then let's build the case. Kevin, start with the financial institutions. We need bank records for Blake Development Corporation, the Blake Foundation, and any personal accounts. Start subpoena processes if you have to, but see what you can get through informal channels first. Look for the shell companies mentioned in these documents and trace the money flows. I want to know every dollar that went in and every dollar that came out. She turned to me. Victoria, you're going to need to go through your memories. I need you to write down everything you remember about your parents' business activities. Everyone you met, every conversation you overheard, every event you attended. Details you might not think are important could connect to transactions we find in the financial records. Also, we need to talk to Rebecca Walsh formally, get her statement on record, and see if she knows of other employees who might have witnessed questionable activities. Over the next several weeks, I lived a double life more completely than I ever had before. During the day, I maintained my normal routine. I went to my office at Blake Financial Solutions, met with clients, reviewed their portfolios, provided analysis on investment opportunities. I had lunch with Jordan when our schedules aligned, attended Lily's soccer games, helped her study for her chemistry exams. To anyone watching, I was just Victoria Mitchell, a successful financial consultant with a loving family and a stable life. But every spare moment was devoted to the investigation. I spent evenings in my home office going through old photographs and documents I'd saved from before my parents threw me out, writing detailed timelines of events I remembered from my childhood. I compiled lists of people who'd worked for my father or served on boards with my mother. I went through old yearbooks and social media to track down former household employees who might have witnessed something relevant. Kevin worked his contacts throughout Denver's business and political communities, carefully and discreetly gathering information. He obtained employment records showing the pattern of household staff turnover at my parents' estate, noting that employees rarely stayed more than 2 or 3 years, which suggested they either saw something that made them uncomfortable or were pushed out to prevent them from knowing too much. He identified the shell corporations mentioned in the documents and traced them through business registries in Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands, building a web of interconnected entities all ultimately controlled by my father. He also started identifying the public officials who'd been bribed. Some of the names in the documents were people still holding positions in city government or serving on important boards and commissions. Others had moved on to state-level positions or retired. Kevin approached this part carefully, knowing that confronting corrupt officials directly could trigger a cover-up. Instead, he focused on gathering evidence of their financial situations, looking for unexplained wealth or spending patterns that didn't match their official salaries. Amanda, meanwhile, started building the legal framework for prosecution. She reached out to contacts in the Colorado Attorney General's office and the FBI's white-collar crime division, feeling out their interest in a major fraud case involving a prominent Denver businessman. She was careful not to reveal too much too soon, but she wanted to know that when we had sufficient evidence, there would be prosecutors ready to act. She also began researching case law on RICO statutes, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, wondering if the pattern of criminal activity documented in the files might support charges that would allow prosecutors to go after not just individual crimes but the entire criminal enterprise my father had built. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. Kevin found evidence of at least 15 major development projects over the past 2 decades where my father had bribed officials, falsified documents, or manipulated the approval process. The environmental consulting firm that had prepared false reports for Mountain Ridge had prepared similar documents for multiple other projects, and Kevin discovered that my father held a hidden ownership stake in that firm through one of his shell companies. He was essentially paying himself to produce fraudulent reports, creating a closed loop of corruption. The Blake Foundation's financial records, which were technically public but rarely scrutinized, showed a pattern of donations coming in from developers and contractors who'd worked on my father's projects, then money flowing out to political campaigns and nonprofit organizations run by the officials who'd approved those projects. It was money laundering disguised as philanthropy, a way to convert potentially illegal payments into legitimate-seeming charitable contributions that provided tax benefits for everyone involved. We also discovered that several of the major investors in my father's projects were themselves using questionable funds. One was a Russian businessman with suspected ties to organized crime. Another was being investigated by federal authorities for his own financial crimes. My father had been taking money from anyone willing to invest, asking no questions about where their wealth came from, as long as they were willing to accept the high returns he promised. But the detail that made my blood run cold was buried in a series of emails Kevin found through his investigation of the environmental consulting firm. The firm's owner, a man named Douglas Porter, had written to my father expressing concerns about the falsified reports. This was 5 years ago, Well after I'd been thrown out but years before Rebecca found the storage unit documents. Porter had written that he was uncomfortable continuing to produce fraudulent environmental assessments, that the liability was becoming too great, that he wanted to end their arrangement. My father's response was chilling in its casual menace. Douglas, I understand your concerns, but I'm confident you'll continue our mutually beneficial relationship. After all, we've built something together over many years, and I'd hate to see that destroyed by an unfortunate disclosure of past indiscretions. I'm sure your wife and children wouldn't appreciate the disruption that would cause to your comfortable life. Let's discuss this over lunch next week, where I'm confident we'll reach an understanding. It was a threat, barely veiled, implying that my father would expose Porter's role in the fraud if he tried to back out, destroying his business and possibly his freedom. And apparently it had worked, because the consulting firm had continued producing false reports right up until 6 months ago, when Porter had died suddenly of a heart attack. Kevin had pulled the medical examiner's report. Heart attack, natural causes, no sign of foul play. But the timing was suspicious, and I couldn't help wondering if the stress of being trapped in my father's criminal web had literally killed the man. How many other people had my father intimidated, threatened, or coerced into participating in his schemes? How many lives had been damaged or destroyed to protect his empire? The teenager who'd once believed her father was a successful businessman was gone, replaced by an adult who could see clearly that Richard Blake was a criminal who'd spent decades hurting people for profit and using his wealth and status to avoid consequences. Rebecca Walsh agreed to provide a formal statement, though she was terrified of retaliation. We met at Amanda's office with Kevin present, and Rebecca spent 3 hours recounting everything she'd witnessed during her 20-plus years working for my parents. She described conversations she'd overheard, documents she'd seen while cleaning my father's home office, meetings held at the estate where she'd served drinks to men discussing what were clearly illegal activities. She talked about being asked to notarize documents without reading them, about finding large amounts of cash hidden in my father's desk, about the time she'd accidentally walked in on my father, and a city council member discussing a payment for an upcoming vote. She also confirmed what the documents had shown about my expulsion from the family. She'd been there that day in March, had been the one my mother ordered to pack my belongings into trash bags and leave them on the lawn. She'd tried to object, tried to suggest this was too cruel, and my mother had told her coldly to do her job or find employment elsewhere. Rebecca had complied, hating herself for it, but needing the income to support her own family. When she'd found the storage unit documents years later and realized the full extent of my parents' criminal activities, she'd felt she finally had a chance to do the right thing, to help expose them and perhaps make amends for her own small role in my parents' cruelty. Her testimony would be powerful, but Amanda warned that a good defense attorney would try to undermine her credibility. She was a disgruntled former employee, they'd argue, someone with a grudge against her wealthy employers, someone who might be fabricating or exaggerating to get revenge. We needed corroboration, other witnesses who could confirm the patterns of illegal activity. Kevin found 2 more former employees willing to talk. One was a project manager who'd worked for Blake Development Corporation for 8 years before being fired when he'd questioned some of the financial arrangements on a project. He'd kept copies of emails and memos, documentation that supported what the storage unit files showed. The other was a paralegal who'd worked for the law firm my parents used for their business dealings. She'd become uncomfortable with some of the transactions she'd been asked to process, documents that seemed designed to hide money or misrepresent ownership structures. She'd raised concerns with her supervising attorney and been told to keep quiet and do her job. Eventually she'd left the firm, but she'd kept her own copies of some of the more questionable documents, insurance against potential liability. With each new piece of evidence, with each witness who came forward, the case grew stronger. We built timelines showing patterns of activity, transaction records showing money flowing through shell companies, communications showing coordination between my father and corrupt officials. Amanda created massive spreadsheets linking all the pieces together, showing how each element connected to the others, building a picture of systematic, sustained criminal activity. But there was still a missing piece, something I needed to understand before I could move forward. I needed to know exactly what had happened in March of 2010, why the timing of my expulsion had aligned so perfectly with the Mountain Ridge deal closing. The documents Rebecca had found showed planning and coordination, but I wanted to hear it directly. I wanted someone to confirm that my parents had made a calculated business decision to throw away their pregnant daughter. That's when Kevin told me about Nicole Brennan. She was my father's business partner, a woman who joined Blake Development Corporation about 12 years ago and had risen to become chief operating officer. She'd been involved in most of the major projects since then, and Kevin's investigation had found her signature on many of the questionable documents. She was, by all appearances, complicit in my father's crimes. But Kevin had also found something interesting. Nicole had recently hired a criminal defense attorney, and there were rumors in Denver's business community that she was nervous, that she'd been asking questions about liability and exposure. Kevin thought she might be a weak link, someone who could be convinced to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Amanda agreed it was worth approaching her, but warned that we had to be careful. If Nicole told my father about our contact, it could trigger a cover-up before we had all the evidence we needed. We decided to make the approach through her attorney, reaching out lawyer to propose a conversation. It took 2 weeks of negotiation, but finally Nicole agreed to meet with Amanda and me at a neutral location, a conference room at a hotel downtown. She came alone except for her attorney, a sharp-eyed woman who made clear from the start that her client was there to listen, not to admit anything. Nicole Brennan was in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested wealth and power. She had steel gray hair cut in a severe bob and eyes that assessed me coolly as I entered the room. I wondered if she recognized me, if she'd been present at the estate back when I still lived there, or if I was just a vague memory of someone who'd existed before her time. Amanda laid out what we knew, walking through the evidence methodically without revealing all our sources. She made clear that we had enough to bring charges against multiple people involved in Blake Development Corporation's operations, and that the decision Nicole needed to make was whether she wanted to be a defendant or a witness. Her attorney listened carefully, occasionally whispering to Nicole, but mostly maintaining a professional poker face. When Amanda finished, there was a long silence. Then Nicole spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "You're Richard Blake's daughter," she said, looking directly at me. "He told me you died, that there'd been an accident years ago." I felt the words hit me like a physical blow. My father hadn't just told people I was studying abroad. He told his business partner I was dead. He'd killed me off in his narrative, completely erasing my existence rather than deal with the inconvenience of having a living daughter who might eventually cause problems. "I'm very much alive," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I'm very interested in making sure my father faces consequences for what he's done. Not just to me but to everyone he's hurt over the years." Nicole studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. A calculation being made, a decision forming. She turned to her attorney, whispered something, then looked back at us. "I want full immunity," she said. "Complete protection from prosecution for anything I was involved in. In exchange, I'll tell you everything. I'll testify, I'll provide documents, I'll give you access to files and communications that will bury Richard Blake and everyone else involved. But I want it in writing, signed by prosecutors before I say another word." Amanda glanced at me, a question in her eyes. This was the moment that would determine whether we could build a prosecutable case, or whether we'd have to try to piece together enough evidence without insider testimony. I thought about my father telling people I was dead, about the casual cruelty of that lie, about all the people he'd hurt over decades. I nodded at Amanda. "Get her immunity. Let's finish this." Nicole Brennan's immunity deal took 3 weeks to negotiate. Amanda worked with prosecutors from both the Colorado Attorney General's office and the FBI, walking them through the evidence we'd compiled and convincing them that Nicole's testimony was essential to building a case that would result in convictions rather than just headlines. The prosecutors were cautious, understandably reluctant to grant full immunity to someone who'd been complicit in years of criminal activity, but ultimately the evidence Nicole offered was too valuable to pass up. She had access to files we couldn't obtain otherwise, recordings of conversations, internal communications that laid bare the conspiracy in my father's own words. The day Nicole sat down for her formal debriefing was the day I truly understood the scope of what my parents had built. We met in a secure conference room at the FBI field office in Denver, a sterile space with no windows and recording equipment set up to capture every word. Nicole arrived with her attorney, looking smaller somehow than she had at our initial meeting, as if the decision to cooperate had diminished her. She carried 3 bankers' boxes full of documents, flash drives containing digital files, and a written timeline she prepared detailing every illegal transaction she'd witnessed or participated in over 12 years. She started with how she joined Blake Development Corporation, recruited by my father after working in commercial real estate for another firm. He'd offered her twice her previous salary, a partnership track, and the promise of being involved in major projects that would cement her reputation in Denver's development community. For the first year, everything had seemed legitimate. Aggressive business tactics certainly, but nothing overtly criminal. Then gradually she'd been brought into the inner circle, shown how things really worked, told that if she wanted to advance she needed to understand that success in development required flexibility regarding regulations and officials who didn't understand business realities. Her first illegal act had been carrying a cash payment to a city inspector, $50,000 in an envelope handed over at a restaurant, in exchange for the inspector overlooking code violations on a project that was running behind schedule. Nicole had been uncomfortable but had rationalized it as a cost of doing business in a corrupt system. From there, the requests had escalated. Falsifying documents, creating shell companies to hide money, coordinating bribes to multiple officials, laundering funds through the foundation. Each time she'd considered objecting, my father would remind her that she was already complicit, that backing out now would mean exposing herself to prosecution alongside everyone else, that her best option was to stay loyal and keep benefiting from the profitable arrangement they'd built. The prosecutors asked detailed questions, drilling down into specific transactions, getting Nicole to explain exactly how each scheme worked. She described the network of shell companies my father had created, corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada with nominee directors who existed only on paper. Money would flow from investors into Blake Development Corporation, then get transferred through multiple shells before landing in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Some of that money was legitimate profit from actual development work, but much of it represented funds that should have gone to contractors, investors, or the government in taxes. The Blake Foundation served multiple purposes in the enterprise. It accepted donations from people and companies who wanted favorable treatment from city officials, then made grants to nonprofit organizations controlled by those same officials or their family members. It paid for expenses that benefited my parents personally, from luxury travel described as charity work to purchases of artwork that hung in their estate rather than being donated to museums. It employed family friends and political allies in nominal positions that required little actual work, but provided them with income and benefits. The foundation was a slush fund that let my parents live lavishly, while claiming charitable deductions that reduced their tax liability to almost nothing. But the detail that made the prosecutors lean forward with particular interest was Nicole's description of what she called the insurance files. My father, she explained, had kept meticulous records of every illegal transaction, every bribe paid, every official corrupted. He created detailed documentation showing exactly who'd received money, and for what purpose, storing copies in multiple secure locations. It wasn't an oversight or careless record-keeping. It was deliberate insurance against betrayal. If anyone he'd worked with tried to expose him or turned on him to save themselves, he could produce evidence showing their complicity, ensuring that anyone who went down would take others with them. Nicole knew where some of these insurance files were kept. One set was in a safety deposit box at Sterling Trust Bank under a shell company name. Another was stored digitally on an encrypted server accessed through a virtual private network. A third physical copy was hidden in my father's private office at the Blake estate, behind a false panel in a built-in bookcase. She'd seen these files personally when my father had shown them to her years ago, making sure she understood that her cooperation was permanent and that any thought of talking to authorities would result in her own prosecution based on the evidence he'd carefully preserved. The irony was staggering. My father's paranoia about being betrayed had led him to create exactly the kind of comprehensive evidence trail that prosecutors dream about. If we could access those insurance files, we'd have everything needed to prosecute not just my father but every official, contractor, and associate who'd participated in the schemes. Nicole's testimony gave us the roadmap to find them. Over the next 2 months, a complex legal dance unfolded. The FBI obtained search warrants for my father's properties, his business offices, and the safety deposit boxes. They subpoenaed records from banks, telecommunications companies, and business registries. They executed simultaneous raids on multiple locations, ensuring my father couldn't destroy evidence once he knew an investigation was underway. The operation involved dozens of agents and coordinators across multiple jurisdictions, and it was planned with the kind of precision normally reserved for taking down organized crime syndicates. I wasn't present for any of the raids. Amanda thought it was better if I maintained distance from the law enforcement operation, avoiding any potential claims that I'd influenced the investigation or contaminated evidence. But Kevin had contacts who kept him informed, and he'd call with updates as events unfolded. The FBI had found the insurance files exactly where Nicole said they'd be. The safety deposit box contained records going back 15 years, detailed spreadsheets listing payments to officials with dates, amounts, and the specific favors received in return. The digital files on the encrypted server included email correspondence between my father and his co-conspirators, discussing illegal activities with a frankness that suggested they'd never imagined law enforcement would access these communications. The raid on the Blake estate had been particularly dramatic. Agents had arrived early in the morning with a warrant, surprising my parents while they ate breakfast in their formal dining room. My mother had apparently tried to refuse them entry, citing their social position and demanding to speak with their attorney, but the agents had explained that a warrant meant they were entering whether invited or not. My father had been more composed, recognizing immediately that something serious was happening, but unable to prevent agents from searching his office, his bedroom, every corner of the mansion he'd believed was impenetrable. They'd found the physical files behind the bookcase panel, just as Nicole had described. They'd also found something else, something I hadn't known existed. A handwritten journal my father had kept, leather-bound and filled with entries describing his various projects, including his thoughts and justifications for the illegal activities. It was a bizarre combination of business diary and personal memoir, passages where he'd reflect on the necessity of bending rules to achieve success, arguments he'd apparently been having with himself about whether his actions were justified. In one entry from March of 2010, he'd written about the Mountain Ridge deal and the problem his pregnant daughter presented. The entry read like a clinical business analysis, rather than a father discussing his child. Victoria's pregnancy represents an unacceptable risk to the Mountain Ridge approval process. The investors are conservative, family-oriented individuals who will not react well to news of a teenage pregnancy in my immediate family. Additionally, the media attention if this becomes public could derail relationships with city officials at a crucial moment. Patricia and I have agreed that the cleanest solution is complete separation. If Victoria is no longer living with us, no longer associated with the family in any visible way, the pregnancy becomes irrelevant to our business interests. It's unfortunate but necessary. She made her choices, and those choices are incompatible with our obligations and objectives. The locks will be changed tomorrow. When Kevin read me that passage over the phone, I had to sit down, my legs suddenly unable to support me. I'd known intellectually what the documents Rebecca found had shown, but seeing my father's own words, his cold calculation that I was simply a business problem to be eliminated, made it real in a way nothing else had. I wasn't his daughter in that moment. I was a line item on a risk assessment, a variable to be removed from an equation. The clinical detachment of his language, the way he'd framed abandoning his pregnant teenage daughter as a reasonable business decision, revealed something broken at his core. Jordan found me sitting at my desk, tears streaming down my face, and wrapped his arms around me without asking questions. He just held me while I cried, finally grieving not for the parents I'd lost but for the parents I'd never actually had. The people I'd believed loved me had been strangers wearing parental masks, performing the role of family while calculating how every relationship and interaction served their interests. I grieved for the 17-year-old girl who'd still hoped they might choose her over their reputation, for the naivety that had made me believe blood meant something, for all the years I'd carried a wound that had been deliberately inflicted by people who were supposed to protect me. But grief evolved into something harder and colder as the investigation progressed. The FBI arrested my father at his office on a Wednesday morning, walking him out in handcuffs in front of his employees and business associates. They arrested my mother at the Metropolitan Club, where she'd been hosting a foundation luncheon for major donors. The symbolism was perfect. My father taken from the center of his business empire, my mother arrested in the middle of the social performance she dedicated her life to maintaining. The news spread through Denver within hours, photographs of both of them in handcuffs, appearing on local news sites and social media. The charges were extensive: multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, bribery, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, and several Colorado-specific corruption charges. The indictment ran to 73 pages, detailing decades of criminal activity with the kind of specificity that left no room for claiming misunderstanding or innocent mistakes. This was a deliberate, sustained criminal enterprise, and the government was prosecuting it with the full weight of federal and state resources. My parents both pleaded not guilty naturally. They hired one of the most expensive criminal defense firms in the country, attorneys who flew in from New York and Los Angeles to represent them. The firm immediately began a media campaign, giving interviews describing Richard and Patricia Blake as successful businesspeople being persecuted by overzealous prosecutors, suggesting the charges were politically motivated, claiming that aggressive business practices were being criminalized. It was a predictable strategy, trying to muddy the waters and create doubt before a trial even began. But the evidence was overwhelming, and more people began cooperating once my parents were arrested. Officials who'd accepted bribes started cutting deals with prosecutors, offering testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. Contractors who'd participated in bid rigging schemes provided documents showing how the fraud worked. Even some of my father's investors, realizing they'd been lied to about where their money was going, started cooperating with the investigation. The wall my father had built around his criminal enterprise was collapsing as everyone scrambled to save themselves. The preliminary hearings were held in federal court, and I attended every session, sitting in the back row of the public gallery where my parents couldn't easily see me. I watched as prosecutors laid out their case, calling witnesses who described the bribery schemes, introducing documents that showed money flows through shell companies, presenting the insurance files my father had so carefully maintained. My parents sat at the defense table looking older somehow, diminished, the confidence and authority they'd always projected stripped away by the reality of facing serious criminal charges. It was during the third day of hearings that my mother finally saw me. She'd been looking around the courtroom during a break, and her eyes landed on my face. I saw recognition dawn, saw her face pale, saw her lean over to whisper urgently to my father. He turned to look, and for a moment our eyes met across the courtroom. I don't know what he saw in my expression, but I saw shock and something that might have been fear in his. I held his gaze steadily, letting him see that I wasn't the scared 17-year-old he'd thrown away. I was the woman who'd helped build the case that was destroying him. During a recess, my father's attorney approached Amanda and asked if we'd be willing to discuss a potential resolution. Amanda was non-committal but agreed to hear what they had to say. We met in a conference room at the courthouse, my parents' defense team on one side of the table, Amanda and I on the other. My parents weren't present, just their attorneys, and the lead lawyer launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about how this had all been a misunderstanding, about how my parents were willing to pay substantial fines and penalties to resolve the matter without trial, about how continuing with prosecution would be expensive and risky for everyone involved. Amanda let him finish, then said simply that the government wasn't interested in a settlement that didn't include significant prison time. The crimes were too serious, too sustained, too damaging to too many people. This wasn't a case that could be resolved with a fine and a promise to behave better in the future. The attorney shifted tactics, suggesting that perhaps there were personal issues at play, that I had an obvious grudge against my parents due to family history, that my involvement in the investigation raised questions about motivations and credibility. I leaned forward then, speaking directly to the attorneys. My personal history with Richard and Patricia Blake is part of the public record now. They threw me out when I was 17 and pregnant because I was inconvenient to a business deal. That's documented in my father's own handwriting. But this case isn't about me or what they did to me. It's about decades of fraud, corruption, and criminal activity that hurt this entire city. It's about bribing public officials, stealing from investors, falsifying environmental reports, and using a charitable foundation as a personal slush fund. My involvement in bringing this to light doesn't change the facts of what they did, or the evidence proving it. The attorneys tried a few more angles, suggesting various deal structures, hinting that my parents might be willing to provide information about other corrupt officials or businesspeople if it meant reduced sentences. But Amanda made clear that the prosecution already had extensive evidence and cooperating witnesses, That my parents had nothing to offer that the government didn't already have or couldn't obtain through other sources. The meeting ended without resolution, and it became clear that the case would go to trial. The trial began on a cold morning in February, almost exactly 15 years after my parents had changed the locks and thrown me out. The symbolism wasn't lost on me as I walked into the federal courthouse, past reporters and cameras, to take my seat in the gallery. The courtroom was packed with media, curious members of the public, and people who'd been affected by my parents' crimes. I saw several of the officials who'd accepted bribes, now cooperating witnesses who'd already pleaded guilty to their own charges. I saw investors who'd lost money when projects had failed due to my father's fraud. I saw residents who'd been displaced by developments that should never have been approved. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks to present, a methodical walk through years of criminal activity. They called Nicole Brennan, who testified for 2 days about the inner workings of Blake Development Corporation, describing specific instances of bribery and fraud. They called former employees who'd witnessed questionable activities. They called city officials who admitted accepting payments. They called forensic accountants who traced money through shell companies and offshore accounts. They introduced thousands of pages of documents, emails, financial records, all showing the same pattern of deliberate, systematic fraud. The insurance files my father had maintained became the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Document after document showing payments to officials, correspondence discussing illegal activities, spreadsheets tracking bribes with the same precision my father had applied to legitimate business expenses. The defense tried to argue that these documents had been taken out of context, that transactions described as bribes were actually legitimate consulting fees or campaign contributions, but the volume and specificity of the evidence made those arguments ring hollow. My father took the stand in his own defense, against the advice of his attorneys. I think his ego couldn't accept sitting silently while his reputation was destroyed, and he believed he could charm the jury the way he charmed investors and officials for decades. It was a catastrophic mistake. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal, walking him through document after document, forcing him to explain transactions that had no innocent explanation, catching him in contradictions and implausible claims. When the prosecutor asked him about the journal entry describing me as a business problem, asked him to explain to the jury why he'd abandoned his pregnant daughter, I saw the jury's expression shift from skeptical to openly disgusted. My mother didn't testify. Her attorneys were smarter than my father's and recognized that putting her on the stand would only make things worse. Instead, they tried to present her as someone who'd been unaware of the criminal activities, a wife who trusted her husband and focused on charitable work without understanding where the foundation's money was coming from or going. But the evidence showed her signature on too many documents, her presence at too many meetings, her involvement in too many decisions. She'd known and she'd participated, and the jury wouldn't buy the innocent wife defense. The trial lasted 6 weeks total, and the jury deliberated for 3 days before returning verdicts. Guilty on all counts for my father. Guilty on most counts for my mother, with acquittals only on a few of the more technical charges where the prosecution hadn't been able to prove her specific knowledge. I was in the courtroom when the verdicts were read, and I watched my parents' faces as each guilty verdict was announced. My father remained stoic, his jaw clenched, refusing to show emotion. My mother cried silently, tears running down her cheeks as her carefully constructed world collapsed. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge delivered a lengthy statement about the seriousness of the crimes, the betrayal of public trust, the damage done to Denver's institutions, and to the people who'd been hurt by the fraud. Richard Blake was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Patricia Blake received 12 years. Both were ordered to forfeit essentially all their assets, everything that couldn't be proven to have come from legitimate sources, which meant almost everything. The estate, the vacation homes, the art collection, the offshore accounts, all of it seized to compensate victims and pay massive fines. I felt nothing when the sentences were announced. No satisfaction, no vindication, no sense of victory. Just emptiness, a hollow space where complex emotions should have been. These people had been my parents, and now they were convicted felons being led away to begin prison sentences that would likely last the rest of their meaningful lives. I'd spent 15 years building a life without them, proving I didn't need them, and now I'd spent months helping to destroy them. It should have felt like closure, like the final chapter of a painful story. Instead, it just felt like ending something that had died years ago, formality rather than catharsis. Jordan was waiting for me outside the courthouse along with Lily. We'd told her everything months earlier, when the investigation had become public and it was clear she'd hear about it from others if we didn't explain it ourselves. She'd handled it better than I'd expected, asking thoughtful questions about why people did terrible things, about whether family meant anything if people hurt each other, about how to reconcile the idea of grandparents she'd never met with the criminals described in news reports. She'd decided she wanted to attend the sentencing, wanted to see the people whose decisions had shaped her life without ever knowing her. As we walked away from the courthouse, Lily took my hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of intuitive concern that reminded me so much of Jordan. I considered the question carefully. "I'm okay," I said finally. "This doesn't change anything about our lives, about who we are. It just closes a door that's been open too long." She nodded, seeming to understand even though I wasn't entirely sure I understood it myself. The aftermath of the trial rippled through Denver for months. Several city officials resigned or were forced out when their acceptance of bribes became public. The environmental consulting firm that had produced fraudulent reports went bankrupt, and its owner faced criminal charges. Multiple development projects were halted and reviewed, with some being canceled entirely when it became clear the original approvals had been obtained through fraud. The Blake Foundation was dissolved, its remaining assets distributed to legitimate charities. Blake Development Corporation ceased operations, its projects sold off or transferred to other developers willing to complete them properly. The media coverage was extensive: stories about corruption in Denver's development industry, features about my parents' rise and fall, investigative pieces about how they'd gotten away with it for so long. My role in the investigation became public, and reporters wanted to interview me, wanted the dramatic story of the abandoned daughter who'd brought down her corrupt parents. I declined every interview request. This wasn't a story I wanted to tell publicly, wasn't a narrative I wanted to be defined by. I'd done what needed to be done, but I wasn't interested in becoming a public figure or turning my parents' crimes into a personal brand. Some people in Denver's business community criticized me, suggested I'd been vindictive or had betrayed family loyalty by cooperating with the investigation. Others praised me for having the courage to do the right thing despite personal cost. I ignored both the criticism and the praise. I hadn't done this for approval or condemnation from strangers. I'd done it because my parents had spent decades hurting people and needed to be stopped because their crimes had destroyed trust in institutions that were supposed to serve the public, because justice required accountability regardless of wealth or status. Blake Financial Solutions, my consulting firm, actually gained clients after the trial. Companies and organizations wanted to hire someone who'd proven capable of uncovering complex financial fraud, someone who had the expertise and determination to see investigations through regardless of how powerful the targets were. I hired additional staff, expanded our services, built the firm into something more substantial than I'd originally envisioned. The business my parents had tried to protect by throwing me away became successful partly because I'd helped expose their corruption. There was irony in that, though I tried not to dwell on it. Lily thrived despite the publicity and challenges. Her friends stood by her, her teachers were supportive, and she maintained her grades and activities without letting the trial derail her life. She was stronger than I'd been at her age, more resilient, better equipped to handle adversity, because she'd grown up in a home where love was genuine rather than conditional on maintaining appearances. Jordan and I had given her something my parents had never given me: the security of knowing she was valued for who she was rather than what she represented. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from my mother. She was incarcerated at a federal prison in California, serving her sentence in a facility far from Denver and everyone she'd known. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on prison stationery, and I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won out, and I opened it late one night after Jordan and Lily had gone to bed. The letter was an apology of sorts. My mother wrote about having had years to think about her choices, about what she'd valued and what she'd sacrificed in pursuit of status and wealth. She acknowledged that throwing me out had been cruel, that prioritizing a business deal over their daughter had been unforgivable. She wrote that she understood if I could never forgive her, that she wasn't asking for reconciliation, but wanted me to know that she recognized the harm she'd caused. She mentioned Lily, the granddaughter she'd never met, and said she hoped Lily had a better mother than she'd been. I read the letter twice, looking for insincerity or manipulation, but it seemed genuine in a way my mother's words had rarely been. Prison had stripped away the social performance she'd maintained for decades, leaving someone who could finally acknowledge truth without worrying about how it looked. It didn't change anything, didn't undo the damage or make what she'd done acceptable, but it was something. An acknowledgement of reality, maybe the first honest communication she'd ever offered me. I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing I needed to say, no relationship I wanted to rebuild, no forgiveness I was prepared to offer. But I kept it, filed away in a drawer with other documents from that period of my life. Someday maybe Lily would want to know more about her grandparents, about the people whose choices had shaped her existence, even though they'd never known her. The letter would be part of that story, evidence that even people who did terrible things could eventually recognize their failures, even if recognition came too late to matter. My father never wrote. I heard through the prison grapevine that Kevin maintained that he'd been railroaded, that the prosecution had been motivated by political concerns, that he'd simply been a successful businessman who'd been made an example of by government overreach. He maintained this stance in appeals that were routinely denied, in interviews with journalists willing to listen to his version of events, in letters to former business associates asking for support. He'd learned nothing, acknowledged nothing, remained convinced to the end that he'd been right and everyone else had been wrong. On a spring morning 5 years after the trial, I drove past the Blake estate in Cherry Creek. It had been sold to a tech entrepreneur who'd made a fortune in software and wanted a showpiece property. The new owner had renovated extensively, changing enough that it no longer quite resembled the house I'd grown up in. The gardens were different, maintained in a more naturalistic style. The circular driveway had been repaved. The whole property had been transformed, given a new identity separate from its history. I slowed as I passed, looking at the place where I'd once believed I belonged, where I'd tried so hard to be the daughter my parents wanted. Then I accelerated and drove on, heading home to the modest but comfortable house in Lakewood where Jordan and Lily were probably having breakfast, where love was messy and real and unconditional, where I'd built the family I'd always needed. The past was behind me, its power finally broken, and the future stretched ahead full of possibility. Richard and Patricia Blake had thrown me away thinking I was disposable, calculating that their empire was more important than their daughter. They'd been wrong on both counts. I'd survived, thrived, built something meaningful from nothing, and their empire had fallen, destroyed by the very evidence they'd carefully preserved to protect themselves. Justice hadn't brought me peace exactly, but it had brought closure. The knowledge that wrongs had been accounted for and that no one, regardless of wealth or status, was truly above consequences. I was Victoria Mitchell, wife to Jordan, mother to Lily, owner of a successful business built on my own merit and determination. The Blake name that had once defined me was just history now, a footnote to a story about corruption and consequences. I'd orchestrated my parents' downfall not for revenge but for justice, not to hurt them but to hold them accountable. And in doing so, I'd finally freed myself from the last chains of a childhood, defined by their expectations and manipulations. I was free, and I'd earned that freedom with every difficult choice, every hard-fought victory, every moment I'd chosen to stand up rather than break down. That was worth more than any inheritance or family name could ever have been. 10 years have passed since the trial ended and my parents were led away in handcuffs to begin their prison sentences. A decade of rebuilding, of watching Lily grow into a remarkable young woman, of deepening my relationship with Jordan, of expanding my business beyond anything I'd imagined when I first started. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, of transforming rage into something quieter and more manageable. The wound my parents inflicted hasn't disappeared, but it's become part of my history rather than my identity. A scar I carry but no longer defines who I am. Lily graduated from college last spring with honors, a degree in social work and a passion for helping families in crisis. She's working now at a nonprofit that supports teenage mothers, providing resources and guidance to young women facing the same challenges I faced at 17. When she told me about the job offer, I cried, overwhelmed by the symmetry of her choosing to help others navigate the exact situation that had shaped her existence. She's turning our pain into purpose, transforming a legacy of abandonment into one of support and compassion. I couldn't be more proud of the person she's become. Couldn't be more grateful that she chose to use her knowledge of struggle to lift others rather than to harden herself against the world. Jordan and I celebrated our 20th anniversary last year with a small ceremony renewing our vows, surrounded by the people who'd become our chosen family over the decades. Angela, Jordan's mother who'd opened her home to a pregnant teenager she barely knew, was there looking older but still radiating the warmth that had saved me when I had nowhere else to go. Rebecca Walsh attended too, the former housekeeper whose courage in bringing me those documents had started everything. She'd become a friend over the years, someone who understood the complexity of my feelings about my parents because she'd witnessed both their public personas and their private cruelties. Blake Financial Solutions has grown substantially, employing 15 people now and handling cases across multiple states. We've uncovered fraud schemes, helped prosecute white-collar criminals, recovered assets for victims of financial crimes. Every case feels like an extension of what I did to my parents, using the skills and knowledge I've developed to hold powerful people accountable when they think their wealth makes them untouchable. The work is meaningful in ways I couldn't have anticipated when I first started the firm, and I've built a reputation as someone who won't back down regardless of how intimidating the opposition might be. My mother was released from prison 3 years ago after serving her full sentence. She's living in a small apartment in Arizona now, working at a library, and living quietly under her maiden name. She writes to me occasionally, short letters updating me on her life, never asking for anything, never pushing for reconciliation I haven't offered. I don't respond, but I read the letters, filing them away with the others. There's something in her words now that suggests genuine remorse, an understanding of what she destroyed that she couldn't grasp during the trial. Prison changed her in ways I'm still not sure I fully comprehend. Stripped away the social armor she'd worn for decades and left someone more authentic, even if that authenticity came too late to repair what she'd broken. My father remains incarcerated, his appeals exhausted, his supporters dwindled to almost nothing. He'll be eligible for parole in 8 more years, when he'll be in his late 70s, and I suspect he'll die in prison still believing he was right, still convinced that everyone else was wrong. Some people are incapable of genuine self-reflection, too invested in their own narratives to acknowledge truth. My father built an empire on lies, and apparently he'll take those lies to his grave rather than admit he was anything other than a misunderstood businessman persecuted by an unjust system. I think sometimes about that 17-year-old girl standing on a manicured lawn holding garbage bags, feeling her world collapse around her. I want to go back and tell her that she'll survive this, that the pain that feels unbearable will eventually transform into strength, that the parents who threw her away will one day face consequences for everything they've done. I want to tell her that she'll build a beautiful life, that she'll find love that's real rather than conditional, that she'll raise a daughter who's kinder and stronger than anyone in the Blake family ever was. But I can't go back, and maybe that girl needed to go through the fire to become the woman I am now. The greatest revenge against my parents wasn't their imprisonment or the destruction of their wealth and reputation, though those things mattered and were necessary. The greatest revenge was building a life so full and meaningful that their rejection became irrelevant, proving that the Blake name and Blake money meant nothing compared to genuine love and honest work in relationships built on truth, rather than calculation. They thought throwing me away would eliminate a problem. Instead, they created the person who would eventually destroy them, but more importantly, they freed me to become someone infinitely better than they ever were. Denver has mostly forgotten about the Blake scandal, moved on to newer scandals and different stories. The developments my father built still stand, though they're owned and managed by others now. The foundation my mother chaired has been replaced by other charitable organizations. The estate in Cherry Creek has been transformed into something that bears no resemblance to my childhood home. Life moved on, as it always does, and the Blakes became a cautionary tale rather than a current crisis. I'm okay with being forgotten. I never wanted to be defined by what my parents did or by my role in exposing them. I wanted to be defined by what I built from nothing, by the family I chose and the work I do and the person I decided to become when faced with impossible circumstances. Victoria Blake died on a lawn in Cherry Creek 15 years ago, abandoned and afraid. Victoria Mitchell was born in that same moment, forged in rejection and determination. And Victoria Mitchell has lived a life worth living, full of love and purpose and meaning that my parents with all their wealth and status never achieved. So when people ask if I regret what I did, If I wish I'd handled things differently, if I feel guilty about sending my own parents to prison, I tell them the truth. I don't regret holding them accountable. I don't wish I'd stayed silent about their crimes. And I don't feel guilty for choosing justice over family loyalty, because they'd already chosen their empire over their daughter years before I chose to fight back. They made me what I became, and they got exactly what they deserved. That's not revenge. That's just consequences finally catching up to people who'd spent decades believing they were immune. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.